Game of Thrones or Sons of Anarchy?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Fleabag?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Boys?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Friends?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Big Bang Theory?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Bridgerton?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Crown?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Stranger Things?
Still Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Sherlock?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Peaky Blinders?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Doctor Who?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Grey's Anatomy?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Lost?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones? Game of Thrones or The Handmaid's Tale?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or The Bodyguard?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Killing Eve?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Succession?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Black Mirror?
Ooh. Probably still Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Narcos?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or American Horror Story?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones or Vikings?
Ah. Vikings.
Vikings it is! Changed your mind last minute.